Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our first edition of Pedia Online Poetry Festival, organized by Ideas in Progress in association with Padasala. Thank you all for being here. My name is Deepak, and I'm the presenter of today's session. Pedia Online Poetry Festival, POP Festival, is an attempt to explore the versification practice of English poets of the day. In the four sessions in the first edition of the event, we have four poets in focus who shall be listened to, and we have four others who shall carry the conversation with those in focus. We will close each session with a reading of the poems by the guest poet who chairs the session. At the outset, let me introduce the two organizations that have come together to make this event possible. Ideas in Progress, an organization that had been engaging with the society for over the past 20 years, helps to bring about spontaneity in expression by kindling the aesthetic sensibility within through a creative process. They open up opportunities to engage with artists from various fields, including poets, musicians, painters, sculptors, film and theater enthusiasts, to share, nurture, guide, and motivate creative engagement. It thereby attempts to fill the ideological vacuum by spurring original thought in a critical endeavor. In collaboration, we have with us Padasala, which is an informal collective of friends at Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, which was formed in 2015 to inspire, engage, and involve the academia with the society, thereby trying to bridge the gap formed due to differences of varied kinds. Our focus is on academic engagement, and therefore our target is creating bright minds. It had always stood for making knowledge available for everyone. I also take this opportunity to welcome the curator of this event, Mr. Chandramohan. Mr. Chandramohan is an Indian English Dalit poet and literary critic based in Trivandrum, Kerala. Warscape Verses, published in 2014, was his first collection of poems. Letters to Namdeo Dhasil is his latest collection. A shortlist for Srinivas Royprol Poetry Prize 2016 and a fellowship at the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa in 2018 are some of his most notable accolades. I take this opportunity to thank him for having made this event possible. Before we begin, a few quick housekeeping guidelines for this webinar. The poet in focus will first read out his poem, and then the second poet shall engage in a conversation with him. While they are in conversation, participants can ask questions using the chat feature of Zoom. May we also request you to maintain your video and audio on mute until or unless asked to unmute. This evening's session will be recorded and uploaded on your YouTube channel for the benefit of those who have missed this event or wish to revisit it at a later date. On behalf of Ideas in Progress and Padasala, may I thank all of you once again for joining us today. We look forward to your participation in this and future sessions organized by us. Now, I'm honored to invite the speaker poet of the day, Somrita Urni Ganguly. Somrita Urni Ganguly is an assistant professor, a poet, and literary translator. She was a Fulbright doctoral research fellow at Brown University, USA, and a fellow at the International Literary Translation and Creative Writing Summer School at the University of East Anglia, UK. Somrita's work has been showcased at the London Book Fair. She has read her works in cities such as Bloomington, Bombay, Boston, Calcutta, Cove, Delhi, Hyderabad, Itanagar, London, Miami, Providence, and Singapore. Somrita presently teaches British literature to undergraduate and graduate students in Calcutta. She has several academic publications and translations to her credit and is a recipient of the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund Award 2013, the Sarojini Datta Memorial Prize 2011, and was selected by the Writers' Center Norwich as an emerging translator in 2016. Madam, I take this opportunity to welcome you to chair and interact with the poet in focus, unfurling her poetic journey, its philosophy, politics, and method to us. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce and welcome the poet in focus of the third day of our event, Mr. Rishi Dastidar. Rishi Dastidar is based in London, England. He studied at Mansfield College, Oxford University, and the London School of Economics. His poetry has been published by the Financial Times and BBC, amongst many others. He is a fellow of the Complete Works, a consulting editor at the Realtor magazine, a member of Mallika's Poetry Kitchen, and chair of writer development organization Spread the Word. A poem from his debut collection, Ticker Tape, was included in the Forward Book of Poetry 2018. A pamphlet, The Break of a Wave, was published by Offord Road Books in 2019, and he's also editor of The Craft, a guide to making poetry happen in the 21st century. His second collection, Saffron Jack, is published in the UK by Nyanarks Press. Sir, we are honored to have you with us in this event as a poet in focus. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you everyone for coming along this afternoon for you and this morning for me. You forgive me for pausing slightly. And you might have noticed my face waver a bit when Deepak mentioned philosophy and journey and methodologies, because I'm far more of an organic writer than that. So, you will need to draw those things out of me rather than me being able to share those with you immediately and straightforwardly. But let's see how we go as I read some poems, and then hopefully that will lead us into that sort of discussion. I think what I'll do is I will start from Ticker Tape, my debut, because I think that still functions as a sort of good introduction to the range of what I write and how I go about writing it. And the leap from that to Saffron Jack, my second book, is so big that I think that could be worth some discussion as well. But let me start with what I normally start with in the days when we did readings face to face, whatever that was like back in February and March. And this poem is inspired by, I don't know whether the show has come to India, but the show MasterChef, amateurs cooking in professional kitchens and all that sort of stuff. The show is inspired by that and makes mention of that. And it also makes mention of a Californian lifestyle magazine called Kinfolk, where the magazine is almost as expensive as the lifestyle itself. The poem is called A Shark Comes to Dinner. Well, it's not a shark as such. More the nebbish simile Woody Allen used in Annie Hall. The one about how Marshall McLuhan has to keep moving forward to massage the message. Anyway, the dorsal fin is frantically stirring the pot, fretting that the lobsters, squash and carrots haven't been chopped finely enough according to the proto-hipster aesthetic, because, would you credit it, him with the teeth is afraid to bleed. Potluck Kinfolk style, she'd said, and he'd flapped a happy yes, not knowing what 2 out of those 3 words meant. But hey, what did it matter? He'd seen enough master chefs to know you just had to do a journey, a chocolate fondant and some alpine micro herbs, then your life changed. Imagine the shock when he discovered that an induction hob could be as dangerous as a pedestal, and she wasn't going to undo her apron for any old Jawsy come lately, brandishing Elizabeth David's come hither Mediterranean words. Calm, she commanded, as she swept him onto the table and bade him wait upon her homemade pastrami. He looked over and tried to drool attractively. You've never seen a mammal wish so fervently to tell Linnaeus to stuff himself, become a slice of rye bread, gherkins, English mustard on the side. And from that ridiculousness to something a bit calmer, a bit more considered. I do a lot of borrowing in my poetry, sometimes acknowledged, often, sometimes not. And I figure that if you're going to borrow, you might as well borrow from the greats. And so this borrows from Horace. I'm sure you'll recognise the bit that is stolen. And the poem references the Bridges of Koenigsberg, the city that is in Kaliningrad, the sort of Russian enclave that's between that's in Eastern Europe, just by Poland. And the Bridges of Koenigsberg are important because that was effectively the birth of modern topography as a discipline, and trying to solve the idea of whether you could traverse one journey around the different bridges in Koenigsberg that connect the islands. So that's buried in this poem too. The poem is called Contour. In every map is a kind of trance, a whisper that insists geography is destiny, no matter what you say. Remember the Bridges of Koenigsberg, the whisper continues. That was an unsolvable problem. And so is your desire to keep moving, to lose yourself in whatever new topography you can conjure with a spin of a compass, as if it's a roulette wheel, rather than a divining rod that keeps reminding you. He who changes the sky above him without changing his soul changes nothing. And now, actually, let me jump from there to something that I think, does play a part in my writing. I have a day job in advertising, where I'm a copywriter in an advertising and design and branding agency. So a lot of that work leaks into the poems, and a lot of both the world that my clients are involved in, but also that broader set of problems and issues that I might face does come into my work as well. And of course, poets hiding as copywriters or making the bulk of their living as copywriters is not a unsurprising thing. And so this is one of the poems that reflects on that, and it's inspired by and name checks David Ogilvy, the founder of the eponymous advertising agency that is still going strong today. And he had a very checkered and interesting career before he actually finally founded the ad agency at the age of 43, 44, something like that. So he came to it very, very late. And one of the things he did was actually spend some time as a chef in Paris. And so this talks to that. The poem is called Making a Cheese Soufflé Rise. David Ogilvy is swashbuckling opposite me, wreathed in the blue smoke of his success. His expression says, "Do not think that advertising is not a job for you, that you are too proud to sell. I burnt my hands in kitchens in Paris, France. And sir, I can tell you these acts of persuasion you undertake are nothing compared to making a cheese soufflé rise under the gaze of an elite brigade you can never join. And once you are done examining your navel, remember that this is a noble calling, alerting the world, waking it up, a poster campaign for life. You are the messenger of a good thing, whatever your Frankfurt school says, a thing called progress, a worthy thing for any man who calls himself a man. Now then, go, rise, work." let me do this, because I don't read it that often, actually. It's called Writ. If I was Henry VIII, I'd reform my state, give up my horses and plate, wrap you in a cloth of gold, marry you 5 more times. Or maybe the better ruler to be would be Shah Jahan, so you'd get a Taj Mahal. But then you'd be dead. And you're best not as a star chamber or tourist tomb, but unrolled parchment, waiting for the laws that will bind us. This is why you should always prep a set list rather than doing this on the fly. Yeah, my performing and reading tip is at least have an idea where you're going to go. Let me jump into I want to read you one of the more political poems. I'm just trying to decide what I can read that doesn't necessarily require an in-depth explanation of left-wing politics in the UK from 2016 to 2020. Let me do this one here. It's got some empire overtones, so I think we can maybe dig into that slightly. It's called The British Genius. The British genius isn't for financing things or inventing games, teaching them to others, playing them fairly then badly, and still turning up. No, it's actually me, all the conversation, the hot air, if you like, that powers everything, anything of worth, note, not of value, that we do. All those lawyers, advertisers, politicos, pundits, journos, stuttering aristos, dare I say it, poets too. What do you think they run on? The charm, the listless seduction, where do you think they come from? You know why the shipping forecast is the nation's secular hymn? It's not for sailors. It's for those in the navy of hyperbole, so they know where to find me, to refill their sails. Yes, this one, I think this one will resonate. It's long, so forgive me, but I often write these things which I call exploded sonnets, poems that I claim are sonnets because they're in 14 parts, even though they have many more lines than 14. And this is one of those. I think it will reveal itself as I go through. The poem is called Risk Patterns. 1. I'm hearing that foxes are feeling put out. The chickens are gathering in chicken-only meetings, discussing how fox violence makes them feel. 2. We like the idea of the South until it knocks on our door. 3. Who is surprised that people want to claim the joys of being exotic, but none of the pain of being different? 4. The thing that really pulled me up. Half the country has fled. 50% gone. In less than 2 years. Did all of them choose to do that? Is it actually a choice when someone shoves a gun in your face and says, go? 5. Whiter man, does whatever a hegemonic culture lets him get away with, frankly. 6. All those brown people quietly condoning terrorism. So unlike all those white people loudly condemning racism. Oh. 7. You know we're an island, right? How do you think most people got here first? They didn't fall from the trees or spring up fully formed from the heather. Some sort of sea crossing may have been involved. 8. There'll never be much compassion in this debate. How can there be when look how I accept it, have done a lot of invading and rarely been invaded? Deep down, what we're expressing is the exasperation that those chaps over there couldn't make a better go of defending themselves against their others, unlike us. 9. I have a recurring dream in which I stand on the table at the dinner party I am attending and say, I am an immigration jihadist. Let them all in. Let's start the throw open all the doors party. I wake up and silently chide myself for being braver asleep than awake. 10. I am an expat. You are a refugee. They are a migrant. 11. Naming the programme Mare Nostrum. The fucking cheek. It's their C2. 12. You know the continent is ageing rapidly. Dying, in fact. Who do you think is going to come and look after your parents, seeing as you don't do extended families? And this is the welcome you give to the people who will be keeping your show on the road? 13. Refuge is not just a place. It's a state of mind, a state of hope. 14. I've already won the lottery. I have a British passport. And let me end this first run of poems with the thing that I always end my live sets with. So you'll have to forgive this indulgence because I haven't read this in about 9 months now. So forgive me, but I have to please myself. And if you leave this seminar with one thing, one injunction, one instruction from me, just please do not use the title of the poem as an adjective to describe the object that the poem is describing. You'll get it once I start reading. The poem is called Gunmetal. The sky vibrates like Mussolini's mistress's dentures in a Waterford tumbler. The sky throbs precipitately pink like the ululating estrogen of a Take That fan. The sky is a precious, precious green, Edmund, a precious, precious green. The sky is as cold as an Ersads gazpacho made out of a homeopathic Aldi tomato. The sky is as playfully obtuse as an obscure collection of Flaming Lips B-sides. The sky is as rigorously gloomy as a Bank of England economic prognostication. The sky is an edition of Noel's house party, full of gunge and the sound of a booming god laughing at our pratfalls. The sky is a flying change of leg in the dressage. The sky is a Tao Lin Google chat, endlessly referring to its own digital circularity. The sky is not the sky, it is the sea, having got terribly confused at Job Centre Plus. The sky is an engine powered by steam and onions and polystyrene chips. The sky is just fucking awesome, okay, and doesn't need a weapons-based simile to make it so. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rishi.
This
was beautiful and very, very transformative, because I mean, I think we really miss that feeling of community, of reading to people and with people, reading at coffee shops and bookstores. I think we're all carrying our coffee shops in our heads now. But thank you for bringing in all that joy and passion and excitement with the readings, despite the sort of barrier that we have in front of each other at this point in time. But I'm really glad that you ended with this poem, because we're going to move from this sky to another sky that you mentioned in one of your earlier poems. Yes. About, I'm probably going to misquote you, and please correct me, because your line was beautiful. But you said about how a person who changes the sky without changing his soul is not really changing anything at all. And, you know, that's how I feel about poetry. And, you know, you have this question thrown at you so often: what's a good poem? How would you define one? How do you read one? And, you know, I've always felt that a good poem is something that changes me a little bit as a person. And it doesn't have to be like a huge seismic shift, but, you know, it could just be like a gentle process of awakening. If I've just changed a little bit from where I was before reading that poem or hearing that poem. What do you see as a good poem? Who are some of the people that you read? Because you also said you steal, borrow, refer, you're inspired by the whole range of words. Who are some people you're reading?
Okay, so lots of things to unpack there right now. The last question is the easiest, because I've been banging on about this book since I read it and reviewed it. It's called Poor by Caleb Femi. And Caleb is a former Young People's Laureate for London, which is sort of the, after the Oxford Poetry Professor and the Poet Laureate, the biggest sort of poetry office in the UK. And Caleb's book is special in part because he's brought us a series of poems and a series of work from a community, a series of people in British culture, which is, if it's barely represented at all, is always done in a stereotypical way, and that's young black men. Young black men growing up in South London. Stereotypically dismissed as gangsters, hoodie wearers, whatever. Caleb has written a book that is just full of the most amazing grace and religiosity, and just vividly brings this world to life, and it's incredibly moving. And it's Max Porter, the British author and writer, has compared it to Blake. I've compared him to George Herbert. You know, this mix of the sacred and yet the profane that's going on here is, for 21st century writing, absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. Now, I can't. I'm not sure I can steal from it, but my God, it's a wonderful book. My God, it's a wonderful book. And it does what you were saying about a good poem changes a little something in you. That he does that. He does that precisely because he suddenly gives you for something. It sounds strange to say it, doesn't it? But you travel through life assuming that you carry humanity for as many people as possible as you meet. But it's not until you're actually presented with it in a really different way that you actually start to appreciate how much your views of people are conditioned by media stereotypes and what you run into. And suddenly seeing this dimension of these lives, it just opens you up. And it has been opening me up every time that I've been going back to it and thinking about it this year. So yeah, definitely that. And I keep embarrassing Caleb by the amount that I keep going on about the book, but it really is fantastic. To get to address the other question in terms of what makes a good poet, I'm going to give you two answers, and one is technical and one is emotional. The technical thing that I always look for, and that I hope to feel implicitly or see or detect on the page or through the air, is some form of energy, some sense that the poem, the words, the images, the syntax in which it's all put together actually functions as a kind of spring to get you as reader from beginning to end. And where poems don't work or don't quite fulfill themselves is because that energy runs out. So it runs out 2/3 of the way through, or it doesn't actually start until 2/3 of the way through, whatever. And it's a hard thing to detect, but that's yeah, that's for me. The poems that don't work are just inert, basically, and don't necessarily come to life in that way. So that's the technical answer. The thing that I tell my students is that, you know, what you want a poem to do, or what I want a poem to do, is I want it to communicate across space and time. A feeling, a sensation, a memory, an experience that you or a persona, doesn't have to be, you know, it can be made up, you know, can be instantly recognized over the space and time by someone you've never met before, and does so in language that is new, but yet at the same time immediately familiar. You know, and then, you know, the smart students, as they start to realize those paradoxes, go, Christ, why have I signed up for poetry? That's impossible. And it is impossible. Of course it's impossible to do that. But that, for me, is what the good poems do. The good poems make you go, how did you know I felt that? I've never met you. You're 400 years old. How do you know that I'm feeling that? You know, you wrote that last week. How do you know that I'm feeling that now? That's what I want poems to do. I want that connection. Yeah, and it just so happens that the way that I do it is through very rich, dense language, but other approaches, other strategies are possible in making that connection too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think this is something I actually just had a class before we logged into this meeting, and we were talking poetry. But yeah, I mean, I completely am on the same page with you on that, because I mean, if I don't connect with a poem, if I don't identify with it, it could have been written 500 years ago. I mean, that's how some poems have survived, and some haven't. It's so crucial, because you could have the craft in place, but they mean nothing, the words, and you know, that's just that, yeah, without that connection. But Rishi, this is something you've talked about before. I was reading one of your interviews last night, and you said you're a bit of a late bloomer when it comes to writing poetry. You started somewhat late in life. What kept you away from poetry, or what made you jump into it when you did?
I genuinely don't know is the honest answer, because I didn't study literature. At Oxford I read history. At the LSE I read media regulations. So literature wasn't really, I was reading novels and stuff, but I just wasn't part of my life. And then I had a Damascene moment in a bookshop, in London's Oxford Street, on about 2007, where I discovered a book by Ders Grunberg, great German poet, called Ashes for Breakfast, his collected. And genuinely, it was the first time that I'd seen a piece of contemporary writing where the lines didn't go all the way to the end of the page, which just sounds so silly, doesn't it? That, I'd not encountered contemporary poetry on the page before until that moment, but I hadn't. And I just read what he was, it was one of those that I just basically devoured the book in the shop. You know, how naughty, but you do it. And I was just like, this is the stuff that I want to write. I loved what he was doing with the classical allusions on the page, the sense of urbanity, his travels around Berlin and New York, and turning those into cockpits of what was going on now, but at the same time tracing the roots back to how to Greek and Roman civilizations. That it was just all. Okay, wow, this is, and you can do all this in this short space, and this, I was just completely hooked. And so that was when it came into my life. But I was, what, about 28, 29 when that happened. So I've sort of felt like I've been playing catch up since then, which it's not necessarily the case, because of course you can come to writing at any age. And certainly in the UK, we can talk about some of the structural issues we have where we maybe are more focused on pushing through and valorising younger writers. because of the economic costs involved, as opposed to, necessarily thinking or seeking out talent that might have started later, or started writing in mid-30s, 40s, 50s, or whatever that might be. But my journey was late, but I'm glad that it was late in the sense that I bring a lot of what I studied and what I thought about, into my work as well. I don't necessarily, I do have capital R romantic tendencies, but, I think, there's a lot of wanting to incorporate the economics, the, capitalism and that world that I'm familiar with as well into the work. And I think that tension sort of gives me some of the unique qualities that my voice has.
And you have been publishing in the UK for a while now. Rishi, you've talked about this in your poem as well. The joy of the exotic, but the difficulty of being different. What has your experience been as a person of colour that's been publishing in the UK?
So, forgive me that this is going to be a very long and nuanced answer, but this has been a long and complicated thing in British poetry, frankly. The starting point for, I think, any consideration, any discussion is the fact that pretty much until the early 2000s, there was no real sense that indeed, poets of colour, whether writing for the page or performing, were viewed as part of the contemporary poetry establishment in the UK. Which is a crude way of saying, basically, if you carried the label poet, you were or were thought of as one. And while there were, and still are, writers and performers to Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, Anglo-Asian backgrounds, some East Asian backgrounds, generally always deemed to be spoken word performers, whatever. And I put it crudely, but you literally had Linton Kwesi Johnson and Derek Walker held up as, well, what are you complaining about? Here are your black poets, writing in English. And it's like, well, hang on a minute, hang on. And so the real year zero for writers of colour in poetry in the UK was a report that Bernardina Evaristo wrote called Free Verse, and she wrote that for the Arts Council. And what she found was basically 1% of collections published in the UK were by writers of colour. 1%. Now, considering at that point the ethnic makeup of the UK is about 12%, it's gone up to about 12 to 15%, massively underrepresented. And so the Arts Council started to put in place development programs to help actually improve that pipeline and actually start to both go out and identify people who are writing and were writing in communities of colour, but also to do that job of actually changing the way that editors, publishers, magazine editors started to think of as what poets of colour could be, who poets of colour are, and crucially what poets of colour write about. And this has been a long-term process. I'm absolutely a beneficiary of that. Complete Works was one of the outcomes from Bernardine's report. And it's something that I think about a lot in terms of paying it back as well, because, in terms of broadening that, that discussion and debate. But I think crucially we're at a stage now where numbers are getting better, if we want to put it crudely, and representation is getting better. The next stage is to now claim more artistic freedom, for want of a better phrase. And the point about the exotic is very, very apposite, and it's something that I feel a lot, because British publishing in particular, across all genres, not just poetry, but fiction as well, has been very, very good at assuming that majority white audience is only interested in writers of colour who exoticize themselves or only talk about their background, their family, their diasporic links back to a mother country that they may or may not have visited, and and issues around different cultural backgrounds, different lives, whatever. And my point has always been, if you want to write that, that's fine. But we as writers of colour must have the freedom to write about whatever the hell we want to write about. And it so happens that I don't particularly want to write about that. Numerous reasons for that. One is I was born in the UK. I'm a British citizen. You can tell from the way that I talk and the way that I present that it's really bloody hard to make me exotic, considering how middle class I am in a UK context. So attempts to actually do that just strike me as odd. Why are you trying to put me into a box that I'm just not going to fit in just because of my skin colour? And so part of the next stage of what diversity and inclusion in writing means is broadening that out and understanding that second generation, third generation, fourth generation, immigrant families, their children, their children's children have markedly different experiences than their parents did. But the writing that we do has to reflect that in totality and reflect the fact that we are as much British as we are Asian, that we are as much African as we are British, but that we are as much Caribbean as we are British. And so what has to happen is that sense of in essence, the sense of the exotic doesn't have to sit on us. It has to be projected back into Britain. It has to be projected back into what ideas of Britishness are, because fundamentally, this won't come as a surprise to anyone in the room, but Britain has not come to terms with post-1945, has not come to terms with post-1947, has not come to terms with the idea of decolonisation, bluntly. And, and so when we say, we are here because you were over there, people sort of nod, but have no understanding of that. And that's our next job. That's our next job, to actually say, well, okay, here's now how you have to start to understand it. And sorry, I'm going on a load here, but I feel this a lot. But you are going to prize my British citizenship from me, from my cold dead hands, because I am as much British as any other bastard born here, right? And if you don't like that conception of Britishness, you have to change what your conception of Britishness is. And Britishness as a citizenship and a nationality has to expand.
For sure. I mean, I'm so glad you took so much time to talk about it, Rishi. I mean, I was hanging on to everything you said. I'm primarily a literary translator, and this is something which a negotiation that I have to enter into almost every day when I'm publishing with UK editors or publishers. But I mean, the first thing is they're going to look at my name and then wonder, oh, is she good enough to translate something into English? Checkpoint number one. And then checkpoint number two is, just how they try to pigeonhole these cultures and communities of people. So if you look a certain way, that is what your story should be about. And hey, I'm not quite sorry.
No, I say a lot of that comes from people not challenging their own stereotypes, but also what they think the audience's stereotypes are.
For sure.
And just that.
Sorry,
and I was just going to say that, and that actually readers can be challenged. You package, you present a book in a certain, people will actually go, you know what, I'll take a chance. And often the fear in publishing and editing is they just can't do it. And part of the job is just encouraging people to be braver.
For sure, we've been talking about this for a while at the Arts Council with the Society of Authors. I mean, what is this concept of this mythical English reader that doesn't seem to want to make room for any kind of difference, whether it's linguistic registers or, just in terms of experience? I mean, how insular is your life that you aren't ready to admit that this is 2020 and your experience is valid, but so is the experience of that person next to you?
So I think I've got a couple of answers to that. And I think part of that relates to the decline in visibility of poetry, certainly in an English context after the movement. And so if you think that you went from the late 40s to the early 60s, where, Larkin was effective, Larkin, Amos, Conquest to an extent, household names. Merseysound people were, McGough Patton were, and then you basically have what I refer to as the art school turn, and and poetry sort of, as you see the rise of pop music, poetry is sort of going back into the academy, and actually, becoming much more conceptual in thinking, and and education not really knowing what to do with that, and so effectively teaching poetry, pretty much frozen in aspic in terms of sort of not really going much beyond movement, Larkin, etc., but also not really knowing how to teach contemporary poetry, and so falling back on this decoding type thing, and this sort of you've got to really understand the not just the subtext but the text below that, and so of course turning understanding poetry into a decoding exercise worthy of MI6 or the Secret Service, as opposed to enjoyment of poetry for poetry's sake. And so you've got swathes of people, swathes of generations who are just fundamentally put off poetry apart from what appears to be the simple piercing clarity of Larkin. And then you put on you into that context, you then have people like me saying, oh, by the way, you need to actually be reading broadly, understanding and reflecting more about what the world is going on. And to an extent, I absolutely understand people just throwing their hands up and going, no, no, actually, my answer to this is to not engage with poetry at all. Now, of course, this is not just a pressure from writers of colour. You see analogous processes, especially in Scottish poetry, especially in Welsh poetry, obviously in Irish poetry, both north and south of the border as well. So, we must not, again, because of the fissile, nuanced state that Britain is, these pressures have been happening there as well. And I think where we have seen an absolute upswing is that gradual understanding that's been gained over the last 25 years that actually, if you want to understand how Britain has changed in that period, and it has changed significantly, for good and for bad, actually poetry is a really good way of understanding that, because you start to get a sense of how different Scotland is now. You start to get a sense of how wild Northumbria and Newcastle are. You start to get a sense of how Birmingham and the West Country and the West Midlands are reviving in that way. And and so I'm ultimately positive that we can draw people in, and actually as they start to come in, they start to discover actually what was presented and pigeonholed as exotic actually isn't, because it's actually pretty much where the country is and where they are. They just haven't been told that yet.
For sure. Rishi, you've got an eye on the time as well. So we will actually start taking a couple of questions from the audience, and then maybe we'll come back to some more that I have. I'll never stop, but that's why time limits are good. So I'm going to take a related one from Omar, and he asks, how does the colonial state inform your poetry? Like, for instance, Brexit as a poetic event of disintegration.
So it's there or thereabouts. And I was just actually yesterday starting to pull together the manuscript for third collection, hopefully. And there is going to be a couple of Brexit poems in there. I think about it a lot in part because I specialised in modern European history as part of my degree. So, that sort of post-45 construction of the EU is something I know more about than probably I should. So it's there. But Umar is very good and insightful in talking about disintegration, because the one poem I've published on it so far is called The Brexit Book of the Dead. And it's literally a transliteration of the idea of the Bardo. And that idea of waiting room and what that's actually doing to Britain and especially Kent right now. And I think more broadly, I think, what I said earlier in terms of Britain not really thinking about empire deeply enough, not thinking about colonialism and post-colonialism, realism enough. I do genuinely think that poetry is one of the vehicles in which you can actually start to do that, and start to do that in a way that isn't necessarily hostile or feels like an attack. Because I think a lot of the debates that have been had here over the last 2 years, especially over the last 6 months, since Black Lives Matter and the pulling down of the Colston statue and Rhodes Must Fall and all that sort of stuff as well, I think genuinely sort of feels to a lot of people, unthinkingly or otherwise, as a full-on attack on what makes Britain great. You know, and I think a lot of that is just actually because of what prose is. And I do think that starting to find ways that we can think about it poetically, opens up different space there as well. So it informs a lot of my thinking, but I think I've only just started to scratch the surface of it.
Okay, we're going to actually move up to the next one. This is from Jayachandran. And the question is, have you experienced what is known as writer's block in your life as a poet? If you have, how did you manage to come out of it? Yay, trade secrets.
Not blocks so much. I think more periods of things are better than others. I'm fortunate in that I draft relatively quickly and I will force myself to write. And you can tell that in saying that forcing myself to write, some things are going to be worse or better. And so, I do a couple of things that just almost, trick myself into producing, as it were. So one of the things I do is, I don't know if you know it, there's a site called Visual Verse, where basically, it's an opportunity to do a piece of ekphrasis, basically, respond to a piece of art. And they publish a new image every month. And they just ask you to write something in an hour. No, that's an honor code type thing, so you can take it. But that's an opportunity where, you don't even have to go searching for inspiration. You've got it up there in front of you. That's 12 opportunities for a poet. Now, 8, 9, 10 of those are going to be bad. One of those could be all right. So I do things like that. This year I've been writing a sonnet every week, acting as a diary for what I've been thinking about this week. So I find that if you're comfortable in using form, you can rely on form as a way of overcoming block. So if you're comfortable writing sonnets, you're comfortable writing triolets, you know roughly where you need to get to with those once you've got a line, and so you can sort of force the rest out. And so so it's not block so much as just actually, if I do feel that I'm stuck, can I just find even a phrase of nonsense in tetrameter or petrameter and force that into something just to get it going again? And it might be 14 lines of rubbish, but one of those I can use to then go off and do something else. The other thing to say, though, of course, is block is not block. Reposition that as a fallow period, which we all need. Fallow period to let the world in, let what you're reading in, mulch down and allow you to go again. So it's never actually block. It's just you actually thinking and you actually letting the world settle in before you actually go again.
Yeah. And actually, I'm a very indisciplined writer, and I wouldn't do what you're doing, write a sonnet every week or every month. There'll be like these long spells of dry period, and then over a weekend I'll have like 20 done. It's just I don't know, I've just never been able to discipline myself enough to do something persistently. But do you have a favorite form? We've been talking about form a bit, skirting around it. Do you have a form that you like?
The Pushkin sonnet. So Onegin is a big thing for me. Look, I say that I literally have Onegin sitting next to me on the desk. So that and obviously so because of that as well, Vikram says the Golden Gate. So I write almost as a standard that Pushkin sonnet more than any other form. Just as and majority they're rubbish, of course they're. But I hear the 4 beats almost a lot more easily than I hear the 5 beats now, and I'm never really fully on top of my masculine and feminine rhymes, but again, Don Patterson talked about the way that rhyme is actually a good way of finding meaning where you didn't think there was any, and so I find that process useful as well, that you suddenly go, okay, I didn't think I thought that, but I do. So I do find that useful.
Yeah, we actually have a couple of questions from Chandra Mohan, and he's going to get very, very mad at me if his questions are not allowed. So he says, your engagement with poetry, both the composition as well as critical engagement, is rigorous. Do you attribute this to the literary ecosystem that has nurtured your literary persona? What do you think is the major takeaway for Anglophone poets of India or South Asia who get introduced to your writing? Look at the Forward Prize Poems compilation. That's what he's asking some of our readers to do. He's talking about the sophistication in your writing, in your style, and he's saying, what can we draw from this as people that are sitting in India and writing in English, South Asia?
So let's start with the rigor. I sound tremendously old-fashioned when I say this, but I make no apology for that. If you know your fundamentals and you know your rules, then you can discard them. And I don't have a creative writing MA. I didn't study English. My sustained period of learning was for 9 months with Joe Shapcott and Daljit Nagra at the Faber Academy. And I very vividly remember the first 6 weeks with Joe was prosody. It was literally, here are your dentals, here are your IAPs, here are your trochees, here are your beats, pentameter, 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 tetrameter, count your syllables, bang, 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 bang. We hated it. We absolutely hated it. The 20 of us around the table were like, oh God, Joe's going to kill us. It's awful. And then we whipped through forms. Like, here are your variations of sonnets. Here are your sestinas. Here are and all the rest of it. But once you've got that baked in, you've got that confidence to then know where you want to, what you want to use and what you want to discard from that as well. So that's where the rigor starts, because you've got that technical confidence and grounding and understanding that you can then build on and start to articulate your poets through. Now, in terms of poetics through, rather, in terms of sophistication, my fundamental thing that I come back to in what I'm trying to do with my poetics is what I call a process of maximalization, where I'm generally trying to see how much I can put into a lyric before it breaks. You will have gathered from what I read that I don't write particularly short lines. I don't go for a single image expanded over the course of a poem. I just don't. I'm trying to go, can I get 3 images on a line? Can I get 4 images in a line? Can I get 4 images in a stanza over da 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 da? And so that's where the sophistication starts in terms of understanding that's what I'm trying to do. And that you get that sophistication through reading, obviously, and reading as widely as possible. And it's cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. If you could, the more that you read, the more sophisticated your understanding of what poetry is. And so that is, and even and that's not just around the British Isles as well. Obviously, it's Anglosphere in terms of America, Canada as well. But I think partly because I came in through a German poet in translation. I've always been aware of sort of European currents as well. Slowly discovering poetics and poets of other cultures as well. And so you start to see what they do, but you always have that wider concern about what am I trying to fit in here as well, and what am I trying to illuminate. And I've always thought a lot about, what are the gaps that are there to be filled. People often say in reviews or that no one writes quite like him. Now that's or he doesn't quite write like anyone else. But that can cut both ways. But a lot of that is due to my willingness to both take on and articulate the fact that I'm not going to write traditional male heterosexual poetry. Because because it's dull. The world doesn't need another Hugo Williams. Bluntly, as brilliant as Hugo Williams is, the world doesn't need another Larkin going on about how crap his life is. And part of what drives me as well is fundamentally my life isn't crap. I speak to you this morning from a house that's 10 minutes away from the Thames. I've got cats, I've got a partner upstairs. I would be fundamentally lying if I then came and threw out lots of trauma at you. Now, that's not to say there isn't trauma, but there are plenty of other poets who do that better than me. What very few poets do is an attempt to try and synthesize an understanding of what it is to be an individual going through political, economic, technological upheaval, and what that does to us, what that does to ourselves individually, what that does to our relationships. And so, in answer to the point about sophistication, it's being able to sort of grab that territory or grab a territory and say, this is the area that I can start to mine. This is the area that I can start to write about because there's no one better placed to do that. And almost in a sense, it's writing from yourself, but being able to take a step outside of yourself to actually say, this is what I'm bringing forward rather than I'm just presenting me. Of course, presenting me to the world works for a lot of people, but I've had to come at it a different way.
Yeah, actually related to that is Chandramohan's next question. He wants to know if you read Indian English poetry at all. And I'm going to read that for you. If we compare Indian English poetry, even after 70 years of decolonization, we have not produced an Anglophone poetry comparable to, say, the poetry in English from the Caribbean. We were talking about Walcott just a little while back.
And so a short answer is no, not enough. And that's a gap that I need to remedy and fix. In answer to the specific point, I think it ties into what we talked about earlier in terms of that fundamental, not just racism, but the lack of curiosity about wider Anglophone writers. And I think, Walcott's a genius, but Walcott is a genius in part because he's working within tropes and understanding and the canon that is much more easily understood by a literary elite in London and New York. Working in Greek myth, working in that sort of stuff. And we've not really had comparable figures from the Indian subcontinent doing something in a similar sort of way, basically until Vikram's death. And even then, he was doing something a bit more playful and a bit more, because he was actually bringing Chinese idioms and stuff as well. I think, in a poetic sense, people really struggle to place him. And it's fundamentally only really with the emergence of Daljit Nagara that we finally get a voice that starts to blend that obvious coming from the subcontinent, but with something that looks recognisably English and British as well. So it's been a different way round, certainly. And that's not to say, of course, there were voices in the 60s, 70s that have been, have been forgotten to time. And we must do better at reviving those as well. But it was, I do think it's that not having idioms or work that fit comfortably and recognisably and easily into things that literary elites sort of recognised, and that's shame on them as much as it is anything else, isn't it?
So I am going to try and bring this to a wrap with a couple of questions about your poetry. Once again, that's where we started. We'll go back to your art. This is from Chandramohan again. The adjectives attributed to your poetry are the following in a review of your book: postmodern, portrait, looping, mirrors, cut. Are they accurate, or is it the white male gaze embedded in these adjectives? Have you ever been a victim of what the West wants to hear from you, that is, as a British Asian poet? I know we've talked a little bit about it, but...
So the second one is easier to answer than the first, in that I've deliberately tried to skip away from what's been expected of me as a British Asian writer, and that idea that I will write about identity, and my identity as a second generation person of colour in the UK. And I always used to very glibly say, no, I don't write about identity, and then I write a whole bloody book about identity. But but almost as a very deliberate artistic and marketing strategy, in that, okay, this is my statement on my identity. That's now done. I'm now going to go back to writing about what I want to write about in terms of my other poetics that I talked about earlier. So, is it victimization? Who knows? I mean, I've had better traction with the second book than I have with the first book, but is that because I've got better as a writer? Is that because difficult to pass that out? In terms of those adjectives, I'm not sure it's a number of those probably originated with me in terms of first draft of blurb, so I'm not necessarily sure that it's white male gaze that's involved there. But the one that is especially accurate is the looping one. I think a lot about how digital technology and the way that we experience the world right now, functions as basically a sense of that sense of loop and sense of going around in circles. And Jane, my editor at Nine Arches, conceived of Ticker Tape as a series of loops. She said there isn't actually a traditional arc in the book. What you're doing is cycles. What you're doing is a cycle of poems, then another cycle of poems, and another cycle of poems. And when she said that, that really opened up the book and unlocked it for us, because we were struggling with sequencing and that. And I think that reflects a lot of what I feel life is like now. That sense that not quite history has ended and not quite the future's not coming, but that sense that, because of the speed at which we live, it's far easier to detect, that looping pattern around the way that our brains think, the way that our brains engage with technology, the way that our brains read, than it is necessarily any straightforward, what looks like a forward arrow of progress, as it were. So looping as an adjective, yes, is very, it's very accurate.
And we've got a final one from Deepak. It's sort of more broad. I keep promising that this will be the end, but maybe this will be. Being a poet of the 21st century and writing from England, we would be glad if you could reflect on what is the plight or state of poetry, both in the market as well as an art form.
It's really good, is the honest answer right now. I think it's in a place where it's got more salience in certainly the UK cultural conversation than it has for the last 25, 30 years. It's in a place where certainly, the industry that I know in terms of advertising is much more aware of poetry as a craft technique and a tool to be used in persuading people. And so, practically speaking, poets are actually getting work. In a strictly numerical sense, sales, certainly over the last 10 to 15 years, have been up. And that's both, an increase of independent publishers who have been able to stabilize and stay for the longer term. Say Nine Arches, my publisher, has been around now for 10, 12 years. And so we've got people that are, not quite at the Blood Axe and Carcanet levels of, longevity, but are, a third of the way there, as it were. And fundamentally, the rise of creative writing education has necessarily led to an increase in good younger poets who are able to actually move to first pamphlet, first collection, second collection. And it's not a conveyor belt, but is there more talent getting through and being published than there was certainly in the mid-90s, late 90s? Yes. Has it definitely got better since I started writing? Yes, as well. No, so all of that is a sort of market-based answer. Do I think the art is in rude health? Yeah, I think fundamentally. My standard line on this is that the last 15 years have shown that if your anthology, if your reflections on what you think British poetry is, does not include writers writing of colour, then you are wrong. There is no way that you can now consider British poetry without some aspect and semblance of colour. That is a momentous change, which we don't necessarily talk about that broadly. But if we talk about our big contemporary poets, people like Simon Armitage, like Joe Shapcott, like Don Patterson, then you have to put people like Walt Sanchire up there. You have to put people like Dean Atta up there. You have to put people like Inuit Elams, Mona Rashi, Karen McCarthy, Wolf up there, Malika, of course, as well. And you will not get a full understanding of what poetry in the UK is like now unless you include those voices as well. And it is not enough to just include, again, to bring things full circle, what we think of as might have been traditional voices. Do I think that those writers have immeasurably deepened, broadened, and richer, made the canon richer and brought wonderful new idiolects, and ways of addressing the world to that? Yes. Does it look like what Larkin might recognise, what Conquest might recognise? No. Who gives a fuck? Guess what? Canons move on. Art moves on. And it's in a pretty good place right now, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's the mantra we should use as sort of like the catchphrase for this conversation. Canons move on. And that's exactly how it should be. Don't let it freeze. Keep writing, keep reading. So we're going to wrap this in this very sort of rushed, hurried way by asking Rishi to read to us a little more.
Sure. Let me read from Saffron Jack, as I haven't done that yet. And I will read the opening, so you'll get a feel for what it is like. It's basically an avatar of me who decides that in response to personal spiritual crisis about not fitting in and not knowing what his identity is, he decides to run away to a war zone to start his own country, because of course that's what you do. But I've written it in a form which makes it sound like it's a legal report or a scientific report, and you'll sort of get the gist. But this is how the book opens. 1. You polish it every night. 1.1. No, not that. 1.2. The crown. 1.2.1. Every night. 2. It's the only way. 2.1. A bit of spit and whatever is to hand. Sometimes just your hand. 2.1.1. What you are wearing. 2.2. It seems to do the trick. 3. Even at the end, you must maintain appearances, the trappings of office. 3.1. Otherwise, what do you have left? 3.2. Yes, it is only symbolic. 3.2.1. Yes, you are only symbolic. 3.3. But it is what is left, what you have left. 3.4. And they're not taking that away. Not now. 3.5. Not yet. 4. You didn't think it would end like this. 4.1. But then no one ever does. 4.1.1. Divine rights and inviolate. 4.2. You get used to being told the position you hold is immortal. 5. By sleight of mind, you come to believe the same. 5.1, that you are immortal. 5.2, because position and person are one and the same. 5.2.1, as vested in you, represented by you. 6, so they cannot ever touch you, no matter the screw-ups you make. 6.1, because they are not mistakes. 6.2, they are whimsical unpredictabilities with a happy effect, keeping consort and court, mistresses and subjects on their toes. 6.3, it is not that you are never wrong. Who possesses the temerity or sheer bad manners to whisper that to you? 6.3.1, to your face. 6.4, no matter the pattern of choices, some sort of internal coherency can always be found. 6.5, a chain of logic that is clear and followable. 6.5.1, even if followable isn't a word. 6.6, even if it is irrational to the outside eye. 6.7, even if it is irrational. 6.8, because what does the outside eye know? 6.9, blinded by the gilded edges of the caravan. 6.10, always confusing the trappings for substance. 7, not that the trappings are not substantial. 7.1, or not necessary. 7.1.1, they are a feint, a distraction. 7.1.2, be dazzled enough by the shiny shiny, you won't ask why everything is only being held by a few pieces of tape and string. 7.2, though someone comes along one day and says, 7.2.1, look, I can see some rust. 8, and then it is all over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rishi. I'm going to let that silence sink in for a bit and then invite Deepak to take over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rishi and Somrita ma'am, especially to Rishi sir for having joined us this early morning and then adding a new flavor to the kind of poems that we've been listening over the past 2 days. So thank you very much for having joined us. On behalf of Padasala as well as Ideas in Progress, I express my thanks and regards to you. Hope we would see you in our future endeavors too. Thank you very much.